January 17, 1945. A frozen road outside Aachen, western Germany. ***. The wind cut through the rubble like a blade. Snow settled on the shattered frames of what had once been homes, now reduced to skeletal silhouettes against a colorless sky. An old woman, her back bent beneath the weight of a wool shawl gray with age and ash, picked her way through the debris. Her breath came in small clouds that vanished almost as quickly as they formed. In her hand she clutched a tin cup, dented, blackened by fire, yet still capable of holding whatever mercy the day might offer. She had heard the engines hours before, the deep rumble that meant the Americans were coming. Not the distant thunder of bombers that had taught her to sleep in cellars, but the closer, more immediate sound of trucks and half-tracks grinding through the snow. She had been told what to expect. For years she had been told. The cup trembled in her fingers, not from the cold alone. For more than a decade, the German people had been fed a narrative as carefully constructed as the autobahns that cut through their forests. The enemy across the Atlantic was not merely a rival nation but a civilization in decay, a mongrel society built on materialism and corruption, a place where culture went to die beneath the neon glow of gaudy advertisements and Hollywood superficiality. The Americans, they were told, were weak, spiritually, racially, morally. They were a nation of shopkeepers and factory workers, of jazz musicians and criminals, bound together by nothing more substantial than the pursuit of profit. They had no soul, no history worthy of the name, no capacity for the kind of sacrifice and discipline that defined the German spirit. Their soldiers, if they could be called that, were pampered and soft, boys who had never known hardship, who would crumble at the first taste of real war. Dr. Joseph Goebbels had been particularly eloquent on this subject. Through radio broadcasts that reached into every German home, through films that played in every cinema, through newspapers that lined every shop window, the message was consistent. America was a paper tiger, a nation of cowards hiding behind industrial production and Jewish financiers. When the Americans finally came to Europe, the propaganda promised, they would be swept aside like chaff before the disciplined fury of the Wehrmacht. The German soldier was hardened by ideology and breeding. The American was soft, undisciplined, a creature of comfort who would flee at the first sight of blood. The woman with the tin cup had believed this once. She had believed many things once. The first American soldier she saw was a young man, perhaps 22, with dirt on his face and a weariness in his eyes that made him look older. He wore a uniform that seemed almost impossibly clean despite the mud of the road, and over his shoulder hung a rifle that he carried with the casual competence of someone who had learned to live with its weight. He was not alone. Behind him came others, a column that seemed to stretch back beyond the bend in the road, and with them came vehicles, trucks laden with supplies, jeeps carrying officers, and behind those, the tanks, massive and thunderous, their treads chewing through snow and stone with equal indifference. But it was not the weapons that made her stare. It was the food. One of the soldiers was eating something from a small brown package, chewing methodically as he walked. Another had a bar of chocolate visible in his breast pocket. From the back of a supply truck she could see crates, wooden crates stacked with a tidiness that spoke of abundance, marked with English words she could not read but whose meaning she could guess from the way the soldiers handled them, without reverence, without desperation, as if there would always be more where those came from. For 4 years, Germany had been tightening its belt. Rations had been cut, then cut again. Butter had become a memory, real coffee a fantasy whispered about in kitchen conversations. The regime had been efficient in many things, but feeding its people had ceased to be a priority once the war turned. There were slogans about sacrifice, about the nobility of hunger in service to the Volk, about how every empty stomach was a contribution to victory. The German people had eaten sawdust bread and turnip soup and told themselves it was temporary, that when the war was won, the abundance would return. The Americans ate chocolate while they marched. She approached slowly, the tin cup held before her like an offering or a question. The young soldier saw her coming and stopped. For a moment, they regarded each other across a distance that was more than physical, across years of propaganda and fear, across the wreckage of a world that had promised order and delivered only ash. She did not speak English. He did not speak German. But the cup needed no translation. He reached into his pack and pulled out a can. She watched his hands. They were not the hands of a savage or a criminal. They were simply the hands of a tired young man who had seen too much and wanted only to go home. He worked a small opener around the can's rim, and when he poured, she saw that it was soup, thick and rich, with pieces of meat visible in the liquid. Real meat. He filled her cup until it nearly overflowed, then nodded once and continued walking. She stood in the snow, holding the warm cup in both hands, and began to cry. This was not an isolated incident. This was the beginning of a revelation that would spread through Germany like water finding cracks in a dam, quiet at first, whispered in cellars and kitchens, growing louder as the evidence became impossible to ignore. The Americans were not what they had been told. Not at all. The architecture of the lie had been comprehensive. Since 1933, the National Socialist regime had constructed an entire cosmology around the idea of German superiority and Allied degeneracy. The United States occupied a particular place in this mythology as the ultimate example of racial and cultural pollution, a nation where Negroes played jazz in nightclubs, where Jews controlled the banks and the newspapers, where the Anglo-Saxon stock that had once been pure had been diluted beyond recognition by waves of immigration from inferior peoples. In the Nazi worldview, this mixing of blood had produced a society without coherence, without the capacity for greatness, a nation that might build factories but could never build a civilization worth defending. The German soldier, by contrast, was the product of centuries of discipline and breeding, a warrior in service to an ideology that transcended mere nationalism. He fought not for profit or territory, but for a vision of the world remade according to natural law, where the strong ruled and the weak served. He was prepared to endure any hardship, accept any sacrifice, because his cause was righteous and his victory inevitable. When the Americans landed in North Africa in November 1942, the German command was confident. These were untested troops, thrown into combat with minimal preparation, and they would learn the cost of their arrogance in the desert. And indeed, at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, the Americans stumbled. German armor punched through American lines, sent inexperienced GIs running, and for a moment it seemed the propaganda might be true. But then the Americans learned. Rapidly, methodically, without the arrogance that prevented learning, they absorbed lessons that had cost them blood and adjusted their tactics accordingly. By the time Tunisia fell in May 1943, it was the Germans who were retreating, the Germans who were running out of fuel and ammunition, the Germans who were being pushed into the sea. Still, the propaganda did not relent. Every setback was temporary, every defeat a tactical withdrawal. The Americans advanced because of their numbers, because of their industrial capacity, because of their willingness to sacrifice their own men in wasteful human waves, never because they were competent soldiers or because their cause might be just. But the civilians did not make policy. The civilians only lived with its consequences. When the British and Americans began the strategic bombing campaign in earnest in 1943, German cities learned what total war meant when it came home. Hamburg burned in July, a firestorm that killed 40,000 in a single night. Berlin burned, repeatedly, month after month. Cologne, Frankfurt, Dresden. The list grew longer, the death tolls climbed higher, and the civilian population that had cheered the newsreels of Wehrmacht victories in Poland and France began to understand that the enemy they had been taught to despise was not weak at all. The American bombers came by day, flying in formations so vast they darkened the sky, protected by fighters that swept aside the Luftwaffe with increasing ease. The precision was terrifying. Factories were destroyed, rail yards obliterated, oil refineries reduced to burning craters. The regime insisted that the bombing was a sign of Allied desperation, proof that they could not win on the ground. But the cities kept burning, and the factories stopped producing, and slowly, inexorably, the certainty began to crack. When the Western Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, the German command assured the population that the invasion would be thrown back into the sea within days. The Atlantic Wall was impregnable, they said. The German divisions waiting behind it were ready. The Americans and British would drown in their own blood before they took a single village. 11 months later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. What happened in those 11 months was not merely a military defeat. It was a comprehensive dismantling of everything the German people had been told to believe about themselves and their enemies. As Allied armies pushed into Germany from west and east, as the Wehrmacht collapsed, as the cities fell one by one, the civilians who had survived the bombing and the starvation came face to face with the reality that propaganda could no longer obscure. The Americans were not savages. They were not the criminals and degenerates of Goebbels' imagination. They were young men, exhausted and homesick, who handed out candy to children and cigarettes to prisoners of war, who shared their rations with hungry civilians even though those same civilians had cheered when the Wehrmacht marched through Paris, who seemed baffled by the depth of the hatred they encountered, as if they could not understand why they were not welcomed as the liberators they believed themselves to be. And the abundance, the sheer, overwhelming, incomprehensible abundance, was everywhere. The symbol that haunted the German consciousness was deceptively simple: the tin can. Not the makeshift containers that German civilians had learned to hoard and reuse, not the ersatz packaging that held the gray sausage and watery soup of wartime rations, but the American military tin can, perfectly cylindrical, marked with labels that promised meat, vegetables, fruit, even dessert, all preserved with a technology and logistics network that allowed an army to carry its entire food supply across an ocean and then across a continent without significant loss. The German soldier who captured American supplies in the early days of the Normandy campaign opened these cans with something approaching disbelief. Canned peaches, canned ham, canned pineapple, a fruit most Germans had only read about in books. The quantity was as shocking as the quality. Every American soldier seemed to carry enough food for 3 men, and behind the front lines, the supply depots stretched for acres, mountains of crates stacked with geometric precision, guarded not because they were scarce but simply to maintain order. The reports filtered back to Germany, carried by wounded soldiers and the occasional officer on leave. At first, these reports were dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda, the kind of desperate invention that surfaces when a war turns bad. But as more witnesses confirmed the same observations, as the evidence accumulated beyond the possibility of denial, the German civilian population began to confront an uncomfortable question. If the Americans could feed their soldiers like this while fighting a war on 2 fronts, while supplying their British and Soviet allies, while maintaining a civilian economy that continued to produce cars and refrigerators and movies, if they could do all of this simultaneously, then what did that say about the comparative strength of the 2 systems? The tin can became a metonym for everything the propaganda had been unable to explain. It represented not merely industrial capacity but a fundamental philosophical difference in how a society organized itself. The German war economy, for all its vaunted efficiency, was built on extraction and slave labor, on squeezing every last resource from conquered territories and working prisoners to death in mines and factories. It was an economy of scarcity, managed by technocrats who understood logistics but not abundance, who could move armies but not feed them properly, who could build tanks but not spare the metal for civilian goods. The American economy, by contrast, seemed to operate on a principle that the German mind found almost incomprehensible: the belief that there was enough. Enough food, enough material, enough energy, enough labor, enough innovation to solve problems as they arose. This was not the result of military discipline or racial purity, but of a political and economic system that, for all its flaws and contradictions, had managed to unleash productive capacity on a scale that the autarkic, command-driven Nazi economy could not match. By the winter of 1945, as the Wehrmacht disintegrated and the front lines moved inexorably toward Berlin, the tin can had become a unit of currency in the black market, a source of nutrition that kept thousands alive, and a daily reminder that everything they had been told was a lie. Civilians who encountered American troops in the occupied zones of Western Germany found themselves navigating a cognitive dissonance so profound it bordered on psychological trauma. These were the enemies who were supposed to be barbaric, who were supposed to rape and pillage and destroy as the propaganda had promised. Instead, they handed out chocolate bars to children. They set up field kitchens and fed civilians from their own supplies, not out of any strategic necessity but because the sight of starving children offended their sense of decency. They brought doctors to treat the wounded, regardless of whether those wounded had been soldiers or civilians, combatants or bystanders. This was not mercy as the German understanding had framed it, a cold, calculated gesture designed to demonstrate superiority. This was something else, something that German ideology had no vocabulary for, a genuine, almost naive belief that people should not starve if there was food available, that children should not suffer for the sins of their leaders, that even enemies were entitled to basic human dignity once the fighting stopped. An elderly schoolteacher in a town near Dusseldorf, interviewed years later, described the moment she first spoke to an American soldier. She had expected arrogance, cruelty, perhaps indifference. Instead, the young man, he couldn't have been more than 20, asked her in halting German if she needed anything. She had stared at him, unable to process the question. Need anything? She needed her city back, her country back, her son who had died at Stalingrad, her daughter who had burned in the bombing of Hamburg. She needed the last 12 years unmade, the promises unkept, the future that had been sold to them revealed as the fraud it was. Instead, she said she needed food. He gave her a tin of corned beef and a package of biscuits, waved away her stammered thanks, and walked on. She carried that tin of corned beef home like a relic, turned it over in her hands, studied the English words she could not read, and wept for the second time that day. Not from gratitude, though gratitude was part of it, but from the sheer crushing weight of understanding what it meant. The Americans had so much that they could afford to be generous. The Germans had so little that they could not afford to be human. The contrast was not limited to food. When the American army liberated the concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, they brought camera crews. The footage was stark, unflinching, almost unwatchable. Mountains of corpses, skeletal survivors who could barely stand, the infrastructure of industrialized murder laid bare for the world to see. General Eisenhower ordered German civilians from nearby towns to walk through the camps, to see what had been done in their name, to confront the reality that propaganda had obscured. Many of the civilians claimed they had not known. This was, in many cases, a lie, willful ignorance at best, complicity at worst. But some genuinely had not known the full scope, had not understood that the rumors and whispers added up to something so systematically monstrous. The Americans forced them to look, forced them to bury the dead, forced them to witness the consequence of the ideology they had supported or tolerated or simply failed to resist. And then, after forcing them to confront this horror, the Americans fed them. This, more than anything, broke something fundamental in the German psyche. The logic of revenge would have been comprehensible. The logic of punishment would have made sense within the framework of National Socialist thinking, where strength punished weakness and the victor's right was absolute. But this insistence on treating even the complicit with a basic level of humanity, this refusal to descend to the level of the atrocities they had uncovered, was alien. The German officer corps, educated men who had read Clausewitz and studied military history, struggled to understand an enemy who seemed to operate according to principles they had been taught did not exist. The Americans fought with overwhelming force when necessary, but they also stopped fighting the moment resistance ended. They took prisoners and fed them. They occupied territory and rebuilt infrastructure. They brought not just military government but engineers to restore water systems, doctors to combat disease outbreaks, agricultural advisors to help restart farming. This was not the behavior of a degenerate race. This was not the behavior of a nation in decline. This was something the German intellectual tradition had not prepared them for, a civilization that combined industrial might with a genuine, if sometimes naive, belief in universal human rights. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Germany provided a stark counterpoint. There, the Red Army came with vengeance in its heart, and the civilians learned what total war meant when the enemy had suffered as Russia had suffered. The Americans, who had lost comparatively few civilians, who had not seen their cities burned by ground invasion, who had not watched their people starved in siege warfare, the Americans arrived with their idealism intact. This, perhaps, was the most damning revelation of all, that the American way of war, for all its industrial ruthlessness, for all its willingness to rain fire from the sky, retained an essential optimism about human nature that National Socialist ideology had spent 12 years trying to eradicate from the German soul. The whispers began in cellars and spread through the ruins. "They're not like we were told." It was a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of a civilization's collapse. Not just the military collapse, which was obvious to anyone with eyes, but the ideological collapse, the recognition that the entire framework of meaning that had governed German life since 1933 was built on sand. The young woman who had cheered Hitler's speeches in 1936, who had joined the Bund Deutscher Madel and learned to see herself as part of a glorious racial destiny, stood in the rubble of her city in 1945 and accepted a cigarette from a black American soldier. The propaganda had told her that such men were barely human, certainly inferior, a contamination of the pure bloodlines that would define the 1,000-year Reich. The man who gave her the cigarette treated her with a courtesy that her own countrymen, brutalized by years of war and ideology, had long since forgotten. She smoked the cigarette in silence, and the framework of meaning crumbled a little more. The factory worker who had believed that German engineering was superior to all others watched American trucks roll through the streets without breaking down, watched American tanks that never seemed to run out of fuel, watched American planes that filled the sky in numbers that made Luftwaffe resistance a tragic joke. He had believed in the superiority of the German system, the discipline and precision that made German products the envy of the world. Now he saw that discipline without resources was just another form of failure, and that the Americans had solved the problem not through ideology but through pragmatism, innovation, and a political system that, for all its messiness, could mobilize industrial capacity that the command economy of National Socialism could not match. The intellectual who had read Spengler and believed in the decline of the West, who had convinced himself that Germany represented a younger, more vital civilization rising to replace the decadent democracies, found his theories collapsing under the weight of observable reality. The Americans were not in decline. They were ascendant. Their movies, their music, their literature, the very culture the Nazis had mocked as shallow and commercial, had won the hearts and minds of the world, including, increasingly, the hearts and minds of young Germans who found jazz more compelling than Wagner, who found Hollywood more exciting than Leni Riefenstahl. The priest who had made his accommodations with the regime, who had told himself that some evil could be tolerated to prevent greater evil, stood in the ruins of his church and tried to reconcile what he had witnessed. The Americans had liberators who were Jewish, who wore the Star of David on their uniforms with pride, who spoke of a homeland they would help build in Palestine. These were the people who were supposed to be the enemy of civilization, the parasites and conspirators of Nazi mythology. Instead, they were doctors treating German wounded, lawyers helping to establish courts, teachers working to reopen schools. Every encounter, every interaction, Every moment of unexpected kindness or simple human decency was another crack in the facade. The truth, when it finally penetrated the collective consciousness, was almost unbearable. Germany had not lost because of a stab in the back by traitors, as the Nazis had claimed after the First World War. Germany had not lost because of temporary bad luck or strategic miscalculation. Germany had lost because its fundamental understanding of the world was wrong. The racial theories were wrong. The economic theories were wrong. The military theories were wrong. The entire elaborate edifice of National Socialist thought, which had promised to elevate Germany to a position of permanent dominance, had instead led the nation to the most complete and humiliating defeat in its history. And the Americans, the weak, degenerate, racially impure Americans, had been the instrument of that defeat. For a population that had been taught to see itself as superior, this was a psychological catastrophe from which some would never recover. Suicide rates among German civilians spiked in the final months of the war and remained elevated for years afterward. Some killed themselves to avoid capture or justice. Others killed themselves because they could not live with the weight of what they had discovered about themselves and their nation. But others, and this was perhaps the more profound transformation, began the slow, painful process of rethinking everything they had believed. The tin can become a starting point for this rethinking. If the Americans could produce such abundance, what did that say about the economic system that produced it? If democracy could mobilize resources and manpower as effectively as dictatorship, more effectively, as it turned out, then what was the justification for dictatorship? If a multiracial, multi-ethnic society could function not only successfully but creatively, producing art and innovation that captured the world's imagination, then what did that say about the racial theories that had justified so much horror? These were dangerous questions in the immediate aftermath of the war, dangerous because they led to more questions, questions about culpability and complicity, about what the German people had known and when they had known it, about what they had done and what they had failed to do. The Americans and British, and eventually the Germans themselves, would spend decades working through these questions in courts and classrooms and endless national debates. But it began with the simple observation: they're not like we were told. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, was the final blow to any remaining ideological resistance. Here was a nation that had every right to demand reparations, to extract revenge, to reduce its defeated enemy to permanent poverty and dependence. Instead, the Americans proposed to rebuild Germany, to invest billions of dollars in restoring the industrial capacity they had spent 4 years destroying, to help create a new German state that would be prosperous, democratic, and integrated into the Western Alliance. The cynics said it was motivated by fear of Soviet expansion, and there was truth to that. The pragmatists said it was enlightened self-interest, a recognition that a prosperous Germany would be a better trading partner and a more stable ally, and there was truth to that too. But there was also something else at work, something the German experience of National Socialism had tried to erase. A genuine belief that people, given the chance, would choose freedom and prosperity over tyranny and poverty. The Marshall Plan succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Within a decade, West Germany had become an economic powerhouse, its cities rebuilt, its factories humming, its citizens enjoying a standard of living that exceeded anything they had known before the war. The contrast with East Germany, locked behind the Iron Curtain and subjected to Soviet-style central planning, could not have been starker. One half of the divided nation prospered under American-backed democracy and market economics. The other half stagnated under communist dictatorship. The lesson was not subtle. By the 1960s, a new generation of Germans had grown up with American military bases on their soil, American products in their stores, American movies in their theaters, American music on their radios. They learned English in school. They studied in American universities. They absorbed, consciously or unconsciously, the values that came with American culture. Individualism, consumerism, skepticism of authority, belief in progress through innovation rather than ideology. The older generation, the ones who had lived through the war, who had whispered in the ruins that the Americans were not like they had been told, watched this transformation with mixed feelings. Pride in what Germany had rebuilt, shame at what had been lost, regret for the years wasted in service to a lie. The tin can, once a symbol of enemy abundance, had become simply a can, a mundane object on a supermarket shelf, remarkable only in its ordinariness. But some remembered. Some kept a dented tin from 1945, tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of the moment when everything changed. The epilogue to this story is written not in archives but in memory. The woman with the tin cup, if she survived, would have lived to see Germany reunified, to see the Berlin Wall fall, to see her nation take its place as a leader in a united Europe. She would have seen American soldiers leave their bases and return home, their mission complete, the threat they had come to counter dissolved. She would have seen German and American soldiers serve side by side in NATO operations, allies in a world that bore little resemblance to the one she had known in 1945. And perhaps, on a quiet evening in her old age, she would have taken out that dented tin cup, turned it over in her hands, and remembered the young American soldier who had filled it with soup when he had no obligation to do so, when she was nothing to him but a nameless woman in a defeated nation, a citizen of the enemy. She would remember, and in remembering, understand something that the propaganda had worked so hard to obscure, that the measure of a civilization is not found in its rhetoric or its ideology or its claims of superiority, but in how it treats the powerless, the defeated, the hungry. That abundance without compassion is mere wealth, but abundance with compassion is the beginning of justice. That the Americans, for all their faults and contradictions, for all their own sins and failures, had carried with them across the ocean an idea that proved more powerful than any army, the idea that human dignity was not something you earned through blood or breeding, but something you possessed simply by being human. The tin can, empty now, incapable of holding anything but memory, rests in a drawer in a house in a country that has learned, slowly and painfully, what happens when a nation believes its own propaganda. The whisper has become a shout, recorded in books and memorials and the architecture of a rebuilt civilization. They were not like we were told. And in not being like we were told, they showed us what we had become, and what we might yet be, if we had the courage to build a world on truth instead of lies. The cup remains. The memory remains. And the lesson, hard-bought and written in ash and tin, remains, that freedom's abundance is not measured in wealth alone, but in the willingness to share that wealth even with those who do not deserve it, because in that generosity lies the only true victory over the darkness that ideology unleashes when it tells men they are gods and others are less than human. The Americans came with their tin cans and their chocolate bars and their naive belief in human goodness, and they won not just a war but a future. The Germans learned, too late, that what they had mocked as weakness was actually strength, that what they had despised as degeneracy was actually resilience, and that the civilization they had tried to destroy was more durable than the one they had tried to build. The whisper in the ruins became the foundation of a new Germany. They were not like we were told. And in that recognition, painful as it was, lay the first step toward redemption.